Welcome to Project Python. This is a series where I, a coding enthusiast, take on several coding challenges to challenge my coding skills and along the way explain my learnings. Each episode focuses on a different problem, and that's about it. So without wasting any time, let's get into this episode of Project Python. Today's challenge is to create a function that can identify a palindrome. The input must be a string containing the word, phrase, or sentence that we want to test, and the output must be a Boolean value, either true or false. As an example, if the function is fed the text madam, then we should expect the output to say true. This is because when you read madam backwards, it's the same word. Hence, it is a palindrome. At this point, I would encourage you to pause the video and try solving the problem yourself. A link to the solution can be found in the description below. Before we start coding, let's break down what a palindrome is. A palindrome is simply a word, number, phrase, or other sequence of characters which reads the same backward as it does forward. Some phrases are perfectly palindromic. For example, the phrase Dennis sinned. This is the same backwards as it is forwards, even if we take into consideration the empty spaces or punctuation. But we usually agree to ignore empty spaces and punctuation and only look at the letters themselves, so that phrases like never, odd, or even are palindromes too. Now that we know what palindromes are, let's try and break down the process of identifying a palindrome through an example. The phrase we have is Roy, am I mayor? In this case, we would get rid of the comma, the empty spaces, the question mark, and make sure all characters are lowercase. Once this is done, all we need to do is check if the resultant sequence of characters reads the same backwards as it does forwards. In this case, this is true. Hence, we can identify the input string as a palindrome, and we would output the Boolean value true. But if this was not the case, then we would output false. To generalize this, we start by filtering out all the empty spaces and punctuation or special characters. Following this, we check if the result reads the same backwards as it does forwards, or in other words, we check if the sequence of characters forwards is the same as the sequence of characters backwards. And finally, if this condition is true, then we output the Boolean value true, and if it is false, then we output the Boolean value false. Now that we've broken down the process of identifying a palindrome, let's start coding. As usual, the first step is to define our function using the def keyword followed by the name of the function, which in this case I will be calling is_palindrome. This function takes one argument, which is a string. In this case, I'll be calling that text. As we saw earlier in the video, we need to filter out all the empty spaces and the special characters or punctuation from our input text. To do this, we're going to be using a module in Python called RE, which stands for regular expressions. Before we use it in our code though, let's take a look at what it is and how it's going to help us. The RE module, short for Regular Expressions Operations, provides functions, methods, or operations that essentially enable the user to search for patterns, strings, or a sequence of characters in a string and then do something with those matches. For example, substitution, replacement, and more. The method we'll be using for this task is the sub method. As the name suggests, this method allows users to substitute the matches we find with a string of our choice. The syntax for this method is re.sub followed by a pair of parentheses. Remember, these need to be curved. Now this method takes in 5 arguments, namely the pattern, the replacement string, the search string, count, and flags. For this case, we don't have to worry about the count and flags. The pattern defines the characters or sequence of characters we are looking for in the search string. The replacement string defines what we want to replace the pattern with. And finally, the search string is the string we want to perform the regular expressions operation on. Later in the video, you will hear me using the phrase raw string. And what I mean by this is that any backslash in the string, which would normally be considered an escape character and therefore allow us to do things like add a new line or horizontal tab space, etc., will now be considered as a literal character. Finally, let's quickly go over what slicing is in Python. Slicing is a method used to iterate over a section of an array. The syntax is the name of the array followed by a pair of square brackets, and now we will mention 3 arguments separated by colons. The first argument is the start index, followed by the end index, and finally the step size. The start index defines the index at which to start iterating. The end index specifies the index at which to stop iterating. The step size defines the increment between the indexes and by default is 1. That's it. Let's get back to coding. So now that we know a little bit more about the regular expressions module and the subfunction, let's use it in our code. Before we can use the module though, we need to import it. So let's go to the top of our code and type import re. So the first step is to create a variable called filtered text, and as the name suggests, this variable will store the filtered version of our input text. To filter the input text, we'll be using the subfunction from our regular expressions module. Now this function takes a few arguments, the first of which defines the characters that we want to substitute. So in our case, these would be all the empty spaces and the special characters, or in other words, anything that is not a letter. The syntax to do this is as follows. We're going to type R, and in single quotes we're going to type \W. This tells the subfunction that we want to look for any non-word characters in the raw version of the string. The next argument is what we want to replace these found characters with. In our case, this is just an empty string. The last argument in this case is the text that we want to perform the filtering process on. In this case, it is the input text, but we need to make sure that we get rid of all the capital letters. And so in order to do that, we will be using the lower method on our text. In terms of code, all we have to write is text.lower with open and close brackets. To recap, what this piece of code does is it takes our input text, converts all the letters to lowercase, and then it looks for any character that is not a number or a letter and replaces it with an empty string. And finally, it stores the result of this process in the variable filtered text. Now all that's left to do is to check if the filtered text is the same forwards as it is backwards. To do this, we first need to create a variable that stores the reversed version of our filtered text. Let's call that reverse. To get the reversed version of our filtered text, we're going to be using a method that is known as slicing. Remember that strings can be treated as lists in Python. So the idea is we want to create a slice that starts at the end of the string and goes all the way to the element with the index number 0, or in other words, the first element. In terms of code, all we have to write is filtered text, which is the text that we want to reverse, followed by square brackets, and we're going to leave the start and the end positions of this slice empty, which tells Python that we want to start at the end of the string all the way up until the start of the string. But now we also need to specify the step size, and this is going to be -1, meaning we're telling Python to start at the end of the string and go in a step direction of -1, meaning one step backwards all the way to the start of the string. Finally, all we need to do is check whether the variables reverse and filtered text are equal. If this is the case, it means that the input string is a palindrome. Otherwise, it means that it isn't. In terms of code, all we have to write is return reverse followed by 2 = 2 signs filtered text. Here, what we are telling Python is to return the result of checking if reverse is equal to filtered text. Another way of doing this is to use an if-else statement, but as a programmer, you want to keep your code as short as possible, and so this is the better way of doing it. With this, we have completed our code. All that's left to do now is to call our function with a few different input texts to see if it works. As you can see, all the results we have got are correct, and this means that our code works. This brings us to the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like and subscribe for more such content. Leave in the comments below any alternative solutions you may have found or any challenges you would like me to take on in future episodes of Project Python.